You're standing over a hot pan. Garlic hits oil, it sizzles, and something almost invisible happens. Suddenly the smell deepens, rounds out, becomes fuller. You taste it. It's richer than salt alone, almost addictive. For decades, people blamed that exact sensation on something they feared: a white crystal. Odorless, nearly tasteless on its own. Accused of headaches, allergies, even a mysterious syndrome no one could quite prove. So what is it really? And how is it made? Because the truth is stranger than the myth. Monosodium glutamate, MSG, is one of the most widely used flavor enhancers on Earth. It's the reason soups feel deeper, snacks feel more satisfying, and restaurant food tastes complete. Not stronger, just more. But that simple white powder hides a process that looks less like cooking and more like brewing life itself. The story begins not in a factory, but in a bowl of soup. In 1908, a Japanese chemist named Kikune Ikeda tasted something in kombu seaweed broth that didn't fit the four known tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter. It was something else: savory, lingering. He isolated the compound responsible, glutamic acid. Then he stabilized it with sodium, turning it into a crystalline powder that could be sprinkled like salt. That powder became MSG. And eventually, Ajinomoto, the company built around it. How it's made today. At first, it was extracted directly from seaweed. Slow, expensive, and limited. But demand grew, and the process had to evolve. And this is where things get interesting, because today, MSG isn't extracted from food in the way people imagine. It's grown. Modern MSG production starts with something surprisingly simple: sugar. Usually from sugarcane, sugar beets, or corn. The kind of raw agricultural input that feeds entire industries. But here, sugar isn't the final product. It's the fuel. Inside massive fermentation tanks, steel cylinders as tall as buildings, this sugar becomes the starting point for a biological transformation. The tanks are filled with water, nutrients, and a carefully selected strain of bacteria. Not random bacteria. Specifically engineered or chosen strains of Korean bacterium. And their job is simple: eat sugar. But what they produce is anything but simple. As these bacteria metabolize sugar, they convert it into glutamic acid, the exact compound Ikeda identified over a century ago. It's the same basic principle used to make yogurt, beer, or soy sauce. Microorganisms breaking down sugars into something new. Except here, everything is controlled with extreme precision. Temperature, oxygen levels, pH, nutrient balance. Every variable is tuned to keep the bacteria in their most productive state. Too much heat, and they die. Too little oxygen, and production slows. Too acidic, and the entire batch can collapse. This is not cooking. It's industrial biology, and it runs continuously. Inside these tanks, billions of bacteria multiply, feed and release glutamic acid into the surrounding liquid. Over hours and days, the concentration builds. But that wasn't always easy. Early fermentation methods struggled with yield. The bacteria didn't naturally release large amounts of glutamic acid. They held onto it. So scientists had to figure out how to make them let go. And this is the part most people never hear. Researchers discovered that by carefully limiting certain nutrients, especially biotin, a vitamin, the bacteria's cell membranes became slightly unstable, not enough to kill them, just enough to make them leak. Glutamic acid would spill out into the broth. What happened next solved one problem and created another. Now you had a liquid rich in glutamic acid, but mixed with bacteria, residual sugars, and a soup of byproducts. So the next step is separation. The fermentation broth is first filtered to remove the bacterial cells. What remains is a clear liquid containing dissolved glutamic acid. But glutamic acid alone isn't MSG yet. To transform it, the solution is treated with sodium, typically sodium hydroxide or sodium carbonate. This neutralizes the acid, forming monosodium glutamate. At this stage, it's still dissolved in liquid. To get the familiar white crystals, the solution is concentrated through evaporation. Water is slowly removed, increasing the concentration until crystals begin to form. And this is where chemistry becomes almost architectural. Crystallization isn't random, Conditions are carefully controlled so that MSG forms uniform, stable crystals. Too fast and you get irregular shapes. Too slow and production becomes inefficient. The goal is purity and consistency. As the crystals grow, they're separated from the remaining liquid, washed and dried. What emerges is the final product. Fine, white, odorless crystals. Chemically pure, structurally consistent, ready to be packaged, from sugar to bacteria to acid to crystals. It's a process that looks more like brewing, refining, and manufacturing all at once.